Lord of Mysteries. Fire of Destruction Chapter 231 to 240. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Between laughs, giggles, and silent grunts, the last bit from a jealous Flora, the trio arrived at Rose Street after 50 minutes. They would have arrived 20 minutes later if it wasn't for Opera asking Adrian to move faster. The redhead had no problem pleasing this curious lady. Leaping from the roof of a house and landing in front of his goal, Adrian carefully lowered Opera, who was still laughing happily. That was amazing, James. I didn't know a person could move so fast and with such agility. We have to do this again. Opera giggled as she adjusted her soft hat that had almost blown off. She looked around the entire street in wonder. This is different to East Borough, she thought, ecstatic. The streets were much cleaner, there was no rotten smell in the air, and best of all, she could see the moon. Her blood-red eyes gazed up at the moon in wonder, her mouth hanging slightly. Seeing how Opera was acting made the redhead chuckle softly. Someday, Opera, someday, he said mysteriously as he approached the front door of the small golden cathedral. Opera turned from looking at the moon and quickly followed Adrian, her heels making a light tap tap tap. James, what are we doing here? This looks like a church, but it's very small. Opera said curiously, her blood-red eyes looking up at the small cathedral. It's the Harvest Church, it's a church that believes in the Earth Mother. Adrian explained calmly as they reached the front door. Opera nodded and turned her head, her attention now on the sacred emblem of life that was on the facade. The symbol was a baby surrounded by the symbols of wheat, flowers, and spring water. Adrian saw this and noticed how Opera's eyes seemed to sparkle with curiosity. This made him sigh internally, very relieved. This is good, change your wonder to Earth Mother and you'll be fine. Right now believing in the moon is not a very good idea. Besides, the Earth Mother is the previous moon, so you just followed her to her new identity, the redhead joked internally. He raised his hand and knocked twice on the door. Not waiting for an answer, he grabbed the handle of the door and pushed it open. He entered unhurriedly. Opera, who had looked away from the baby, looked a little stunned at what the man had done. Hey James, what are you doing? You can't go in like this. It's a church, she whispered in alarm. Adrian turned and tilted his head. He replied unimportantly. But I knocked on the door before entering, so there's no problem. Opera was stunned. But James, she said quietly in disbelief. The door is open for all, he added as a matter of fact. Opera was speechless. And what we do here is simple. This is your new home, Adrian continued with a smile under his mask. Opera's expression broke, her face went completely flat. James, have you lost your mind? Adrian just smiled under his mask and said nothing. The sound of heavy footsteps had reached his ears. He turned his head to the side. This action confused Opera, who looked to where Adrian was looking. A giant man came calmly walking out of the corridor at the end. Despite the brown cleric clothing he was wearing, she could see how the man was a mountain. Would it be possible to know what are you doing here at this hour? Utravsky asked, trying to make his voice sound calm but ended up coming out a bit harsh. This scared Opera, who hid behind Adrian. Seeing the woman's movement, Adrian's eyebrow began to twitch, but he let it go. He looked at the father and spoke in his natural voice. It's been a while, Father, I'm sorry to bother you at such times, but I couldn't think of anyone better for this than you. The father's body visibly relaxed and his eyes softened a bit more. So it was you. I'm glad to see you're doing well. May I know why you brought that lady here? Utravsky asked, his voice now calmer than before. He didn't say Adrian's name, and this made the redhead smile. As expected from an experienced Beander, he decided to play along with me. Good job, Father. I would like her to work here in the church with you and Sasha in exchange for her living here. He did not mince words and told the father the reason for his visit. The mental state of the father did not allow him to play as he wanted, so he had to control himself to avoid provoking the man. Utravsky closed his eyes for a moment and let out a soft sigh. He then opened them and looked at Opera in detail for a few seconds. He then nodded. It won't be a problem, miss, could you tell me your name please? Utravsky spoke softly, not wanting to scare the woman any further. Opera didn't move or say anything. This made Adrian sigh, and he turned around a bit and gently stroked Opera's head. Father Utravsky is a trustworthy man, you don't have to be afraid of him, he consoled Opera, who after a few moments nodded slightly. She broke away from Adrian and stood next to him, a bit nervous. My name is Opera. I'm sorry I bothered you at this time, Father, she introduced herself and apologized, curtsying. Yutravsky's expression softened, he nodded with a small smile. Don't worry, little one, the doors of the church are always open for everyone. These words made Opera's eyebrows tremble, but before the woman could say anything, the father continued. Are you sure you want to stay and work here? You will have to follow certain rules and learn the Earth Mother's Bible. Are you fine with this? Opera didn't say anything, she turned to look at Adrian looking for an answer. At this, the redhead shook his head. I won't make that decision for you, he said seriously. I'm sure I could always drop you off at an Evernight Goddess Church orphanage, I'm sure they're understaffed with so many babies around. The redhead quickly thought of a plan B in case Opera rejected the father's offer. At Adrian's words, Opera pouted a little but said nothing. She just lowered her head and began to think about what to do. She then looked up and looked at the sacred symbol of life that was on the altar. She stared at this symbol for a few minutes. Neither Adrian nor Yutravsky said anything, giving the woman time to think. After a while, Opera nodded determinedly, her blood-red eyes turned to look at Father Yutravsky. I accept, Father. The giant nodded with a soft look. It's good to hear that, Opera. I welcome you to the Church of the Earth Mother, he said calmly, placing his hands in front of his mouth and nose, fingers interlocked and palms empty. This was the prayer posture of the Church of the Earth Mother. Opera, not knowing what to do, made a soft bow in response to what the father was doing. To her eyes it looked like he was about to sneeze. Ignorant of Opera's thoughts, Yutravsky lowered his hands with a soft smile. We'll talk about how you'll adjust to this. Now it's too late and I'm sure you're tired. At the end of this corridor there is an extra room, that will be your room from now on. Opera turned to look at Adrian with a concerned expression. Adrian nodded gently. Remember, Father Yutravsky is a trustworthy man, he will take care of you. Opera opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, but nothing came out, so she closed it. After a few seconds, she was finally able to ask. Will you come to see me? This question took the redhead by surprise. Controlling his body to keep from showing a reaction, he chuckled softly and nodded. I may not be able to come very often, but you'll be working with a friend of mine. If you have something to tell me, just deliver a letter to her and she'll deliver it to me, he explained calmly, patting her gently on the head. Now go, it's late and I'm sure you're tired. Opera just nodded. She started to walk to her room, but before taking the fourth step she stopped. She turned around and quickly approached Adrian and gave him a big hug, burying her head in the man's chest. Thank you, she whispered very softly, but still Adrian was able to hear it. She then broke away from Adrian and ran into the hallway without looking back. Adrian looked stunned for a few moments, but he quickly recovered and watched as Opera headed into the corridor. Flora, it's not necessary to go back into her dream to take away the idea, right? The redhead whispered, barely above a breath. First, like I'm going to walk in again, you bastard. Second, I can drop the idea anytime I want, just tell me when and it's done. Flora said with a shiver. Being unknowingly infected and having to pray to a hidden god to be cleansed was enough of a night for her. After praying to him, she wouldn't dare to call him an evil god. That was a death wish. Besides, she didn't even want to be close to that woman, nor did she want that woman to be close to what is rightfully hers. Then wait until we get to the hotel to put the idea down, by then Opera should be asleep. Fine by me, Flora said happily. Adrian shook his head, he then turned to look at Yutravsky. One last thing, Father Yutravsky, I would like you to give Sasha something from me. It won't be a problem, Yutravsky agreed calmly. Adrian took a goatskin parchment and his red fountain pen from his jacket and wrote something quickly. He folded the parchment 3 times and handed it to Yutravsky, who tucked it into his robe without looking. Adrian then put a hand to his chest and bowed. Have a good night, Father. Yutravsky nodded slightly. You too, Adrian. The redhead didn't say anything else, he just left the church. Walking into his room, Adrian was drying his wet hair with a towel. He was now wearing a simple brown shirt with gray pants. Fucking shower, using a hose to bathe would be so much better. The redhead thought, annoyed as he spread the towel on the chair to dry. The shower pressure had been the lowest these past days and it had taken him a long time to get a good bath. Clicking his tongue, Adrian sat on the edge of his bed. Flora, you can now remove the idea from Opera's mind. I don't know why you bother to withdraw the idea after what we went through, but I'm not interested. Flora said, exasperated. The soft sound of cloth being cut reached Adrian's ears. This made his mind blurry for a few seconds, but he quickly recovered. Wow, that was. Adrian put a hand on his forehead and massaged his temple. Did you hope that getting the idea out of someone's head wouldn't hurt? Well, Normally, but my state again doesn't help. Flora answered, still annoyed. There was a trace of tiredness in her voice. Adrian's eyes softened a little at this. She has done a lot today, it is obvious that she is exhausted. In addition to the scare that I gave her, tonight has undoubtedly been very heavy for her. It wouldn't be fair if Flora didn't receive a worthy praise. You did a great job today, Flora. Without you, all of this would have been much more difficult. Thank you, he said gratefully. His gaze had softened more and his scarlet eyes shone with warmth. Of course, you should be grateful. The great Flora put her mighty hand in your operation, making it possible. She said, proud and pleased. You could tell she was a little embarrassed by her voice. So praise me more. Adrian chuckled, amused at this. Now you're acting like a puppy that got a treat. You're adorable. He didn't say this because Flora deserved a moment to enjoy, he could still notice the tiredness in her voice even though she tried to hide it. So smiling, he nodded and continued. You were the best today. Ho ho ho. Of course, I was. I am a Jacob after all. Flora laughed with joy. After petting the puppy Flora for a while, she reluctantly had to go to sleep to recover from all the energy she spent today. Adrian also lay on his bed and went to sleep, although, in reality, he had gone to the City of Calamities to count the winnings before resting. Sitting on the yellow ground of the city, Adrian had in front of him the wads of bills arranged in rows. 300, 400, 500, and 800 inches, the redhead said, finishing counting the last bill. A huge grin that showed all his teeth was plastered on his face. 8,800 pounds. The jewelry and property have yet to be sold, which should add up to a total of 14,000 pounds. I'm rich. I'm fucking rich. The redhead was almost crying with joy. I no longer have to worry about not having enough money to buy the Sphinx's brain. Ha ha. Ha ha ha. Ha ha ha. The redhead laughed with pure happiness. Now he could even try to get the conspirator formula from the pirate auction and the hermits of fate. Still laughing, the redhead grabbed the goatskin parchment at his side and opened it. Main ingredients. Murloc's bladder. * 10 Murloc scales. Supplementary ingredients. 100 milliliters of seawater. 1 clownfish intestines. 10 milliliters of rum. 15 grams of beach sand. Main ingredients. Ads by PubFuture. * 1 pure gold dew. * 1 Leviathan scepter crystal. Supplementary ingredients. * 100 milliliters of beer. * 3 drops of night watcher's herb. * 10 grams of emerald powder. * 3 seeds of the will-o-wisp fruit. Main ingredients. A pair of terror demon worm's eyes. Silver war bear's right palm. Supplementary ingredients. * 80 milliliters of white wine. * 20 milliliters of oak water. 10 grams of lead. The stem of Justicia spicigera. Main ingredients. The horn of a flash-patterned black snake. Dust of a lake spirit. Supplementary ingredients. * 70 milliliters of Lowen beer. * 6 gold bullets. * 12 grams of silver powder. 5 milliliters of the poison of the black snake. I honestly didn't expect to get these formulas, but they are certainly welcome. The redhead said, amused as he made the parchment fly towards his things. He then moved his gaze to where he kept the Beyonders' characteristics. He didn't plan on handing these over to Isengard in exchange for contribution points. The interrogator characteristic contained a sheriff and arbiter characteristic. He could resell this or use it on a future member of his team if necessary. The same was with the characteristics of sailor and hunter. The problem will be finding a way to separate the characteristics. I'll need an artifact equal to Unshadowed to be able to achieve that, but I have no way to get one right now. Sighing, Adrian looked away and looked up at the city sky. For now that will have to wait, the important thing is that now I have the formulas. Adrian closed his eyes and concentrated on feeling the pyromaniac's progress. After a few moments, he opened them. Less than 30% to fully digest it, he murmured to the sky. Sighing again, Adrian began to draw the sphere of light in his mind to leave the Sephiroth. Opening her eyes, Opera was slightly confused to see that she was in an unfamiliar room. Her head hurt a little. Taking a hand to her forehead, she caressed her temple to try to soften it. Slowly, memories of the night before came back and it made her stomach turn. Trembling slightly, she put a hand to her mouth to keep from screaming. Why did I act like that? That was the first time I saw Jam, that man, and I treated him like he was my childhood friend. If she is not wrong, that must have been the famous James Holmes. I was controlled. That's why I did all those weird things. She gagged and had to swallow the vomit to keep it from coming out. Ads by PubFuture. Why would he do that? Did I do something to him? Rising slowly from the bed, she made her way on unsteady legs to the door. Just as she touched the doorknob, she stopped. Her blood-red eyes glowed with realization. I am free, she muttered in a daze. Slowly removing her hand from the door handle, she lowered her head and looked at the ground. A shaky smile formed on her face. Now I can do whatever I want. I don't have to work for him anymore. Tears were falling from her eyes. But where can I go now? I have nothing. Her expression broke into despair. This will be your new home. The words spoken by James returned to her head and she widened her eyes in surprise. After a few seconds, she let out a small, soft, teary laugh. She could still remember how the man had said it, as if it were fact. But that's how it is now. Opera looked around. I won't make that decision for you. The smile on her face turned soft. Now I have this room in this church. He didn't force me to be here, but he let me choose. That was a lot more than anyone had let her do for as long as she could remember. Neither her mother nor her father let her do that. In the end, it was a stranger who let me make the final decision. The memory of how the man had treated her returned. How he looked away to let her get dressed without looking at her naked body, how he had held her hand when she was afraid of the height, how he carried her on his back and carried her at full speed through the East Borough, how he had made her laugh much more than anyone had done in her entire life. He had shown her something she had never been shown in her entire life. She put a hand to her head and began to caress it gently, in the same way that the man had done. The shaky smile returned, but this time it was filled with happiness. No, James. She choked on her words in tears. He's a warm friend, she cried hard, falling to her knees. Thick tears fell down her cheeks. The memory of how the man had hugged her had returned, making the tears fall harder. Adjusting her brown clerical robes, Opera looked at herself in the mirror, her eyes still a little red from crying. Come on, Opera, you can do this, she gave herself encouraging words as she looked at herself in the mirror. She slightly slapped her cheeks twice, a determined look in her eyes. She went to her bedroom door and opened it. Walking down the corridor into the church hall, she saw the huge Father Yutravsky praying in the front row next to a woman. This woman looked no older than 24 years old, she had brown hair and freckles on her face. She was wearing a modest dress. She watched as these two people prayed, not sure what to do now. Some footsteps sounded next to her and she looked in amazement as a giant woman came down from the altar area with a cloth in her hands. She was wearing the same clothes as her. This giant woman had beautiful yellow-orange hair and green eyes. Despite wearing clerical clothing, she could see the muscles under it. You must be Opera, right? Father Yutravsky told me that we would be working together from now on, this huge woman said with a smile from ear to ear as she extended her hand. It's a pleasure. My name is Sasha and I hope we can get along. Opera looked at the woman's scarred hand in surprise, but after a few moments, she took the hand with some mistrust. My pleasure, Miss Sasha. Sasha chuckled lightly and shook her head. Just call me Sasha. Taking a soft sip from her cup of tea and feeling the taste of the finely selected leaves and the softness of the milk caused a small smile to grow on her lips. Sitting back in her chair, her emerald green eyes gazed at the lively talk in front of her calmly. Did you read the newspaper? Mr. Holmes did it again and attacked a dead-shot hideout in the middle of the night. A noble girl said in astonishment, speaking to a young noble who nodded and added. The 27 guards who were there were killed, and according to the witnesses he did it alone. A brown-haired girl dressed in a fine green dress heard this and also added something. Not only that, he even killed the gang leader by burning him alive. It's obvious that he's a Beander. And a powerful one. Could it be some secret member of the churches who is in charge of protecting the streets of East Borough? The first girl asked excitedly. The noble boy shook his head and said seriously. Churches would never allow one of their members to be so famous, is certain that he to work alone. The girl who was corrected instead of getting angry about it smiled brightly and said excitedly. But doesn't that make it more amazing? Not only does he protect the East Borough but he also avoids the clutches of the churches. The girl's face filled with realization. He's like the Robin Hood from the famous Emperor Russell stories. Several gasps of astonishment sounded, they then began to discuss how the man had been able to do this and his similarities to other heroes from the Emperor's stories. The corners of her lips twitched slightly. James Holmes, she thought, a little curious about the man. Is it certain that he is a Beander, though I wonder which sequence he is, 7 or 6? A young man with ash-yellow hair turned to look at her somewhat confused, a bit of concern danced in his eyes. Audrey, don't you have something to say? The corners of her mouth trembled slightly again and she unconsciously came out of the spectator state. Sorry, Glaint, I was a little distracted, she said apologetically as she lowered the ceramic teacup. Glaint's expression creased slightly in concern, but he immediately recovered and covered that with a small formal smile. But in the eyes of a spectator, he was an open book. Knowing that she could no longer act, she could only sigh and skillfully joined the conversation. This was enough for Glaint that the smile he wore was less forced. Audrey only said what was necessary, throwing out the odd comment or opinion. After chatting for a long time, the party came to an end and Glaint dismissed every member who had attended until only he and Audrey were left. Returning to the room they had used for the party, he closed the door and let out a tired sigh. Sitting down in his chair, he raised a hand to his head in disbelief. How did the occult club go from talking about mysticism and looking for opportunities to become a Beyander to the Holmes fan club? It's been a long time since anything this interesting has happened. Give them about 2 months and they'll put this behind them, Audrey calmly comforted Glaint, who nodded weakly. It was obvious that he was sad about how his club had fallen. Ads by PubFuture. Audrey would be the same or even more upset than Glaint if it weren't for one fact. Now I'm in a real Beyander club. Not some poor noble children's attempt to imitate that, she thought proudly, a small smile forming on her face. Not only that, but I've become a spectator. A true Beyander. Thinking of that made her remember the reason for her visit, which made her smile tremble a little. She still hadn't made any progress with Mr. Chariot's payment. She had been so busy with her piano, etiquette, dance, and writing classes that she hadn't had time to contact Glaint. Tomorrow is the Tarot Club. If I go and tell Mr. Chariot that I haven't made any progress with his request, the only thing I will get is to be teased by him. She thought with a chill going up her spine. She still hadn't finished recovering from the last time. Not wanting to waste any more time, she deliberately sighed a little loudly. This caught Glaint's attention and he stopped wailing and turned to look at Audrey curiously. Seeing how his friend's face had a sad expression, he got worried. He went and quickly sat down in front of her. Audrey, what's wrong? Is there something bothering you? Sorry about this, Glaint, but I don't want to feel Chariot's wrath. Audrey mentally apologized, but outwardly she just made her expression sadder and sighed heavily. It's nothing, Glaint. It's just that my parents will most likely be mad at me when they find out what I did and they will punish me, she said sadly. She looked at her friend's face and her performance almost broke. Glaint's mouth hung in disbelief. It was so obvious what the man was thinking that even a normal person would notice. Audrey. The innocent Audrey did mischief. Seeing how he was being watched by Audrey's sad eyes, Glaint put his thoughts aside and focused on his friend. Your parents adore you. I doubt it's something big enough for you to have to worry about that much. Glaint tried to comfort the young lady, but Audrey looked away with some embarrassment. This made Glaint's expression crack again. Audrey, what did you do? Audrey took a few seconds to answer. I took some things from the family vault to try to create a charm according to the instructions in a mysticism book I managed to obtain. But all I did was make a mess and waste the materials. And the materials are ones that took my parents a long time to get, she added, the tone of her voice dropping with each word until it ended just above a whisper. Why would you do something like that? Glaint asked, stunned. Audrey continued her act and looked away in embarrassment. I was very excited and wanted to test if the information in the book was real. She then turned her head to Glaint and making the most helpless face she could do, she spoke desperately. Please, Glaint, I don't know what to do. Glaint put a hand to his forehead and caressed it stressed. After a few moments he sighed, he lowered his hand and looked at Audrey. I think I can help you. Tell me the materials you took. I'll check my personal vault and see if I have them. Ads by PubFuture. Audrey's face lit up with true joy. She clapped her hands together and said gratefully. Thank you very much, Glaint. Now she would not suffer the wrath of Mr. Chariot. Yes, you owe me one. Glaint accepted the applause but also reminded Audrey, who nodded with a smile. Now tell me the materials you used. I'll go get them now and I'll give them to you in a basket before you leave. Audrey was even more glad to hear this and happily said what she needed to. A matured manhellfish's eyeball and goathorn blackfish blood. Glaint's brow furrowed for a few moments, but he immediately recovered. Audrey noticed this change but did not comment on it. Glaint sighed and scratching his cheek with his finger, he answered. I still have a container with the blood, so it won't be a problem, but I don't have the matured manhellfish's eyeball. Audrey's face filled with despair. I don't have anyone else to ask this of. What am I supposed to do now? Does that mean I will suffer Mr. Chariot's wrath? She did not trust any other noble besides Glaint to obtain the ingredients. The reason why she didn't ask another noble was quite simple. She didn't want to attract the attention of the psychology alchemists. Every time she felt the urge to do that, she reminded herself of Chariot's words about this organization. She started playing with her fingers to calm down. She tried to find other options to save herself. Glaint, who was looking at Audrey, was very surprised by this abrupt change. It seems that the punishment she will receive is quite terrifying, for her to be like this. Not wanting his friend to suffer such severe punishment, Glaint considered something for a few seconds before sighing. Maybe Dutch has one left. I can get you the manhellfish's eyeball, but you will have to wait a few days. How long do you think it will take your parents to realize it's missing? Recovering from her episode, Audrey took a few seconds to respond. Every Wednesday, they do an inventory check in the afternoon. This was a lie. The inventory review was done every 2 weeks on Saturdays. Sorry, Glaint, but the faster I can get Chariot the materials, the better. She was only willing to put up with bullying from the man once. She didn't think she could handle two. Hearing the answer, Glaint just nodded and took a pensive pose. Dutch hasn't answered any letters to me this whole month, nor has he attended any other party that I know of. I'll have to visit him this time. He had free time on Tuesday morning. I will write him a letter to let him know that I will visit him. Already with the decision made, he looked at Audrey seriously. I'll let you know on Tuesday. Audrey nodded faintly at this. Ads by PubFuture. Above the gray fog, in the Divine Palace, a figure was seated at the end of a long antique bronze table. 2 crimson flashes and a torrent of crimson fire with black spots appear. As they receded, 3 figures appeared seated in their respective seats. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool, Audrey curtsied. She then smiled and said, it is unfortunate that there was no wine here, otherwise we could toast your successful attempt. You are more powerful than we imagined. Alger praised the same. Adrian didn't say anything, he just nodded with a small smile in Klein's direction. The smile that was on Klein's face turned tight. Mr. Chariot's gaze is much more terrifying than the monster Ray Bieber. Klein thought, suppressing a shudder. A few days ago he had had his first fight in this world and had also seen the terrifying monster that Ray Bieber had become. Every time his eyes fell on that monster he couldn't help but compare it to Chariot's true appearance. Ray Bieber looked like a puppy next to Chariot's demonic appearance, and that was him being nice to the monster Bieber. High sequence beyonders are terrifying. Klein held back a sigh, he then smiled and said, great, this means that we are on the path to excellence. If you have any issues that leave you unable to attend the meeting on Mondays, perform the ritual and inform me. All you have to do is change the incantation from the line less than I pray for a good sleep greater than for the reason. All right, Audrey quickly agreed. She continued. Mr. Fool, I have obtained another page from Emperor Rassel's diary. I think I still owe you a page. I've been away from land this week so I couldn't get any pages. Alger placed his right hand on his chest and bowed in apology. I have another 2 pages, Mr. Fool, Adrian said in amusement. At that, Klein nodded slightly. Internally very happy. That's good. He then turned to Alger. Don't worry, I expected this request to take a long time. Klein leaned back in his chair, tapping his armrest with his index finger. He looked at Justice and Chariot and said calmly, you can express the content of the diary now. As you wish, Audrey and Adrian said. The lady curtsied while the redhead just nodded. A parchment and pen appeared in front of them. They both grabbed the pen and remembered the symbols. The patch was filling up. When the parchment was filled, they both lowered their pens and said, it's done. Klein raised his hand and made the parchments fly to him. He shifted his gaze downward, reading without emotion. July 9th _ I suddenly thought of an interesting question. July 12th _ I've noticed another fact today. July 14th _ I have seen that mysterious Mr. Zeratul again. While Klein was reading the pages of the diary with full attention, Audrey looked over there and started looking at him out of habit. However, her field of vision was blocked by the thick fog. Momentarily taken back, Audrey snapped back to her senses and turned her head frantically to look at another illusory red star that stood next to her. I was too careless, too insolent, too foolish in trying to observe Mr. Fool. I'm lucky he's not angry. Audrey secretly stuck out her tongue and pretended to admire the scenery. Hee. She thought that her performance had worked and none of the members had realized what she had done, but a soft chuckle was heard. Her face paled, She turned her head robotically in the direction of laughter and saw that Chariot was looking at her. Oh no. Chariot didn't say anything, he just held up a finger and shook it from left to right, like he was telling a kid not to make any more mess. No words were spoken, but Audrey's breathing became harsh and upset. It wasn't even 4 minutes. Klein, who discreetly looked at what had happened, could only lament internally for justice. He could only look down and began to read the pages of the diary delivered by Chariot expectantly. The page that Justice had delivered was rich in information. He had confirmed several things by reading the page. Like that Zeratul is the leader of the secret order and that the pathway this organization controls is the seer. I hope the pages delivered by Chariot also contain something interesting. If one page was rich in information, then 2 pages had to be superior, right? Klein thought, not as confident as before. His answer came when he read the first line of the first page. January 27th. I found out that this new body is allergic to shrimp. Why did I get excited? Klein thought resignedly. He could only put his disappointment aside and continued to the second page. Maybe this one will be different. Klein was unable to complete his thought as he read the next page. June 4th. Not much to say about today, just mentioning that Amelie is still as dominant as ever. If he had been alone, his face would have puckered up as if he had eaten a lemon with salt. But since he was in a group, he was forced to keep his normal expression. He wiped the pages from his hand and looked at the trio in front of him. He smiled. Sorry for the wait. Alger, who had always kept his head and eyes on the Lisa of bronze, was the first to speak. It is our honor. Audrey froze a little. After a few seconds she turned to look at Chariot and spoke a little awkwardly. Mr. Chariot, I only need one more ingredient to complete our deal. You should receive everything by Wednesday at the latest. Hearing those words, Adrian couldn't help but be a little surprised by this. He sighed and spoke quietly. No problem, Miss Justice. When I receive the materials I will give you the formula, but they have to be before next Monday. Before Audrey could rejoice that she hadn't been hassled for not getting the materials, Adrian continued. Honestly, I'm surprised. I thought nobles would be able to get this easily, but it turns out they're not as capable as I thought, he said, unimportant. Audrey could feel her blood pressure rising. All she could do to respond was nod shakily and speak, barely containing her annoyance. Sorry for the inconvenience. Adrian said nothing and just nodded calmly, an amused smile on his face. There was really no need to rush Audrey to get the ingredients as he still had no one to deliver the potion to. Putting that aside, he turned to look at the Hanged Man. Mr. Hanged Man, how's the pirate auction going? Anything new? Alger nodded. It will be in a few days, on the 5th of August. Through my contacts, I have almost managed to get confirmation that the Sphinx's brain will be there, but I need more time. A sharp smirk grew on the redhead's face. It's good to hear that. Adrian nodded, satisfied. I want to add a few things to my request, Mr. Hanged Man. It shouldn't be a problem for someone like you, right? A blue brow twitched, but calming down, Alger nodded again. First of all, Mr. Chariot, we haven't discussed my payment yet. Oh, you're right, Adrian exclaimed in surprise, slamming his fist into his palm in a hammer motion. Alger's eyebrow twitched more strongly, but before he could say anything, Adrian spoke. Aside from getting me the Sphinx's brain, I need you to see if the conspirator formula is in the auction. It's obvious that the Sphinx's brain will sell for a high price. Assuming it's there in the auction, it's easy to expect it to fetch a minimum price of £4,000. The conspirator formula, depending on the seller, will sell for a minimum of £2,500. Taking all this into account, then a payment of 10% is fair. Alger frowned. That's too low, Mr. Chariot. It's going to have to go up to 25% if we're going to make a deal here. Adrian chuckled softly. You're quite funny, Mr. Hanged Man. Although I think there's something you haven't understood, but don't worry, I have no problem explaining it to you. We're talking 10% of at least £6,500, assuming the conspirator formula is there, of course. That means at least £650 will be paid. If this deal still bothers you, we can do this. £800 will be the payment you will receive. It doesn't matter if you get the formula or not, but you have to get the Sphinx's brain no matter what. If you agree to this, the payment will be £800, not a penny more or less. The payment will not increase and will stay that way. What do you think of these deals? Which was the one that scratched you where it itched? The redhead asked, amused. Alger let out light growls that he tried to control. After a few moments, he spoke, clearly upset. If you want a deal, it will have to be at least 1.000 pounds, Mr. Chariot. Otherwise, you can forget about it. Wow, so scary, Adrian said, amused, and this annoyed Alger even more. The air between the two men became tense, Klein and Audrey watching this uncomfortably. Audrey turned to look at Mr. Fool for help, and the corners of Klein's mouth twitched hard. Before Klein could do anything to defuse the situation, Adrian spoke. No offense, Mr. Hanged Man, but there's something I've noticed about you. Alger didn't say anything, he just looked annoyed at Chariot. Adrian continued, not caring that Alger had ignored him. You're poor. Alger could feel his control slowly slipping, he was seconds away from jumping on the man. The only thing that stopped him was Mr. Fool, who was looking at all this impassive and immovable. Actually, Klein was ready to cut Chariot's connection as soon as he made a move that went too far. Adrian held up his hands to calm Alger down. Don't worry, Mr. Hanged Man, I know what it's like to go through that. After all, if there is something universal in all the churches, it's the shitty salary they pay us. One would hope that with all the donations and offerings they receive, one would have the highest salary, but sadly that is not the case. Saying that, Adrian laughed in amusement as if he had told a rather funny joke. The anger Alger was feeling vanished completely, and he looked at Chariot in astonishment. That was the same case with Klein and Audrey, looking in disbelief at what the man had said. This guy just insulted all the churches without mincing any words. Aren't you afraid of being burned at the stake? Klein thought, dumbfounded. Blasphemous. Alger and Audrey thought the same thing. Adrian, not caring about the look he was receiving, spoke between laughs. I have thought about how to solve that, and I have come up with a solution that will satisfy all of us. He raised his hand and pointed it at Audrey, who was taken by surprise. And it's all with the help of our noble lady here. What? Audrey blurted out, confused by this abrupt change. She still hadn't finished processing what had happened. Adrian didn't give anyone time to think and continued. Miss Justice, it's obvious that you as a newcomer to the Beander world don't know much about the secret organizations that inhabit and rule it, am I correct? Audrey subconsciously nodded. Adrian smiled at this. He then pointed to Alger and himself. As your elders in this world, it is only fair that we tell you of these secret organizations. Obviously, it will be at a fair price. You know, like I said, the church's salary sucks. The redhead chuckled softly. What do you say, Miss Justice? Are you interested in this deal? Huh, Audrey blurted out, she was still very dazed. Chariot hadn't given her time to think and even forced her against the wall. Adrian turned to look at the stunned Alger. And what about you, Mr. Hanged Man? Are you also interested in this deal? Huh, what just happened? Klein thought incredulously and dumbfounded. He was sure that if Chariot had asked him the same question, he would also like Justice and the Hanged Man. After a few moments he recovered his ability to think and realized what the man had done, and he couldn't help but feel a chill cover his entire body. High-sequence Beyonders are terrifying. He first provoked the Hanged Man to the point that he almost attacked him to lower his guard, then he changed the subject of the conversation and insulted all the churches. For the people of this world, the churches are to be respected at all times, insulting and blaspheming against them would shock and stun the people of this world. By doing this, Hanged Man and Justice's defenses were completely destroyed, and he was able to control them to create a three-way deal that they couldn't refuse. This deal was not only too valuable for Justice, who is, as Chariot said, a newborn in this world and needed that knowledge, but also to Hanged Man, that if his reaction to being called poor is any confirmation, he was in dire need of money. And at the end, there was Chariot, who didn't need any of that but managed to get the benefits by manipulating the previous two like they were marionettes, and he was the marionettist pulling the right strings to get what he wanted. Thanks to being a transmigrator and a keyboard warrior, Klein was able to somewhat understand what Chariot had done, but he was still confused. And this only further reaffirmed his idea that Chariot is a high-sequence Beander. It took a few more moments for the others to recover. But when they processed what Chariot had said and done, they both realized they had been played. Audrey bit the inside of her cheek and squeezed her dress under the table. Ads by PubFuture. Alger had a lost look. After another while, Audrey was the first to speak. Mr. Hanged Man, Mr. Chariot, I'm interested in the deal. She accepted. She knew how stupid it would be to refuse this. Alger turned to look at Chariot. Even though his face was blurred and slightly covered by the mist, he was sure that the man was smirking. Gritting his teeth, Alger lowered his head slightly and nodded. I'm also interested. Adrian clapped his hands and said in amusement. Perfect. I'm happy that we have reached an agreement as a club. Audrey tightened her grip on her dress and Alger ground his teeth harder. Then we will do this. There is no need to have a private chat with each one since it is very certain that there will be information that will be repeated, so let's do this. Mr. Hanged Man and I will write what we know in a patch, and when we're done Mr. Fool will verify that the information is true and not repeated. Adrian turned to look at Klein, who tensed. Does this seem fair to you, Mr. Fool? Audrey and Alger turned to look at Klein. The corners of his mouth twitched slightly. Hey, if you're going to make decisions for me, why do you ask me if that's fair? Klein thought bitterly. He couldn't refuse this, so he could only nod quietly without saying anything, as if this wasn't something remarkable enough to make him speak. At least I'll be able to learn more about the secret organizations this way. Klein looked on the bright side of this as he watched the interaction in front of him. Perfect, Adrian said sweetly. He looked at the tense Audrey and Alger and chuckled slightly. Since we are talking about secret organizations and the information we have about them, a price of £1,000 seems quite fair to me, but don't listen to me, tell me what you think. Alger hated it, he really hated it, but he nodded in agreement. I hope the information is worth it, Mr. Chariot, Audrey said seriously, and Adrian just nodded with a smile. He turned to look at Klein and nodded. We are ready to start, Mr. Fool. Klein said nothing, he just made the pen and goatskin patch appear in front of Chariot and Hanged Man. Adrian calmly grabbed the pen and began to express what he wanted to sell. He obviously wasn't going to reveal everything he knew. If he did that, he would only kill Audrey and Klein with this information. So what he did was reveal things that Alger would have no way of knowing, and he didn't write down the most important information nor the two most important organizations. One thing that made him giggle internally was that he hid a funny detail that he would say later on the gathering. After a while, he and Alger finished writing and put down their pens. Klein simply raised his hand and made the parchments float to him. Ads by PubFuture. He first read the information written by the Hanged Man. He reread this about 2 more times, then he began to read the one written by Chariot. Finishing reading the parchment calmly, outwardly he seemed serene and calm. But on the inside he was quite surprised. While the information on both was repeated a few times, the information Chariot had written far exceeded that of the Hanged Man. He settled back in his seat and considered whether the price was fair. Although the information from both is of different quality and quantity, it is still very valuable. Perhaps it should even be more expensive, but information is repeated and this lowers the price. In the end, £1,000 is the most appropriate price. With his decision made, he spoke calmly. The information and price is fair. That was all he said, and he floated the parchments to Justice. Audrey grabbed the parchments with a tight smile. Before starting to read, she turned to the Fool and curtsied. Thank you for your help, Mr. Fool. Klein smiled slightly and nodded. No problem, Miss Justice. It's the least I can do considering I got that information for free. Klein thought, with the corners of his mouth twitching slightly. He had no idea how long it would have taken him working as Nighthawk to get just a fraction of what he'd read. But he couldn't help feeling that he had taken advantage of Justice and Hanged Man. The next time they need something, I won't charge you anything. Then the equivalent trade will be fulfilled. Klein quickly decided to make it up to Justice and the Hanged Man when he gets the chance. He didn't mention Chariot because he had no idea what he could give him to make up for it. What could he have that would interest a high-sequence Beyander like Chariot? Audrey just nodded reverently to Mr. Fool's words. Doing so, she lowered her head and began to read the information she had purchased against her will. She slightly lowered the parchments with a surprised and somewhat dazed expression. There were so many organizations in the Beyander world. She slightly shook her head and looked at the men. This information is certainly worth the £1,000 I pay, Audrey said. She then continued. But I have some questions about something you wrote, Mr. Chariot. Adrian grinned and nodded. It will be my pleasure, Miss Justice. Tell me, what is your question? What do you mean when you remarked that the pathway controlled by the demonist sect is the... According to the Hanged Man, the pathway they control is the assassin. Is perhaps another name of this pathway? Is it because the abilities of this pathway are related to traps or something like that? Audrey asked innocently. Is something like that, but not the way you think it is. Adrian's smile had turned mischievous. Klein nodded at Audrey's question. That was something that had confused him when reading it. I thought the path that the demonist sect controlled was called. Why then does Chariot call it? Could it be an old name perhaps? Honestly, if among the options he had been given for the pathways was the assassin, he would likely have chosen it. That would be if he had never read that page of Emperor Russell's diary where he regretted not choosing the seer, marauder, or apprentice pathway. Adrian chuckled again, but this time was a little darker. This made everyone present nervous. Klein suddenly felt the urge to put his hands to his crotch. That's quite simple, but first I'll ask you a few simple questions, consider them a little test to see if you learned what we wrote to you. First question, are there any men in the demonist sect? There are none, Mr. Chariot, even when a boy is born in the sect they kill him, there are only women in its ranks. Audrey answered confidently. That's something the information you gave me didn't have, unlike the hanged man. She took the opportunity to provoke the man because he didn't know something as important as that and she did. But because she was still a newborn, she was unaware of a problem that Alger and Klein noticed the moment she pointed it out. Especially Klein. Chariot is a high-sequence Beyander. How is it possible that he doesn't know something as important as that? That doesn't make sense. He thought confused, but immediately his eyes sparkled with realization. Or is the information not correct and that's why he didn't write it? How is it possible that a member of the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom does not know such well-known information? Or does he know something that we don't? Alger narrowed his eyes at the redhead. Adrian waited a few seconds, not saying anything on purpose, so that Klein and Alger would notice the problem that Audrey pointed out. Second question, what is the name of the path that the demonist sect controls? It's the assassin pathway, she answered confidently and also added teasingly. That's why it confuses me so much that you call it. Or is it that you didn't know what it was called and made it up? Adrian chuckled in amusement at Audrey's lame attempt to provoke him. I'm sorry, Miss Justice, but you still have 50 years to go before you can provoke me with those kindergarten insults. I'm sorry to inform you that those so-called insults of yours only work with others your age or younger. A vein began to throb on Audrey's forehead and she began to growl in annoyance. Klein and Alger looked at this and inwardly shook their heads. I'm sorry, Miss Justice, but you asked for this, you never provoke the provocateur. Klein thought, feeling bad for the woman, but did nothing to stop the assault. She growled, but before she could continue she was interrupted by Adrian. Last question, what is the name of sequence 7 of the assassin's path? Everyone present was taken by surprise by this question. Audrey was confused while Klein and Alger could sense that something bad was about to happen. You do not know? The redhead asked with false surprise, which was too obvious. This annoyed Audrey, but holding back her annoyance she asked. I don't know what the name is, Mr. Chariot, is it relevant to my question from before? Adrian chuckled darkly. Ads by PubFuture. It is, miss, believe me, it is. The air in the Divine Palace turned cold and heavy, especially for Alger and Klein. Adrian stopped beating around the bush and finally revealed the secret. The name of the sequence 7 of the assassin pathway is which? Quote. 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 Everything in the Divine Palace seemed to freeze. What do you mean by that, Mr. Chariot? Audrey asked, stammering, her stomach wanting to release its contents. Klein had to contain a gag and the need to take his hands to his crotch to verify that his soldier was still there. Alger had frozen. Hee. Adrian chuckled softly and replied. Exactly what you are thinking. You know that saying in Intis. The one about. Every woman in the demonist sect was once a man. Oh goddess. Audrey muttered in astonishment as she fell into her chair and put a hand to her forehead. Alger tied the ends together and couldn't help but want to vomit. Klein's expression had frozen into his calm face, but his mind was something else. Praise you, goddess. Praise you for not letting me choose that pathway. Klein was so grateful that he began to sing to the goddess in his mind. Audrey was the first to recover, she looked at Chariot in shock and dumbfounded. But how is that possible, Mr. Chariot? Changing gender. Are there other pathways that do that? Is there one that turns a woman into a man? She asked, horrified, if her pathway was one of those. A prank came to his head, so laughing darkly he responded. Everything is possible in the Beyander world, Miss Justice, from men being turned into women and women being turned into men, it is even possible to turn a person into a goat. Everyone present was stunned by this information. Alger put a hand to his forehead and began to massage it to calm his mind. But Adrian hadn't finished his antics. In answer to your other question, there are several paths that change the gender of a man to a woman, an example would be the seer pathway and sailor pathway. He turned to look at a frozen Alger. In the future, it is very likely that we will have a Miss-Hanged Man. Klein's skin had turned pale, but for the thick mist covering him, no one saw his horrified expression. The happiness that had previously filled his mind was replaced with horror and despair. No. Fuck you, Russell. Because I followed your advice now I will become a woman. If this continued like this, it was likely that Klein and Alger would lose control. So to avoid that, ha 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 ha, Adrian laughed maniacally as he punched the bronze table, his entire body shaking with laughter. Oh fuck. How I wish I could see your faces. HAHAHHAHAHA. Ads by PubFuture. Tears were falling from Adrian's eyes. Alger robotically turned his head to where Chariot was. Was that a prank? He asked weakly, his expression slowly breaking into a completely furious one. He had to hold on to his seat to keep from jumping on the man. Klein eyed Chariot with pure venom. I just have to control the gray fog and I could drown him. No. That's too easy. He began to consider possible punishments for this madman who had given him the biggest scare of his entire life. What's wrong with you, Chariot? Are you crazy? Audrey yelled furiously, no longer able to control herself and exploding at the man. Huff huff, sorry you guys were so stiff I thought you needed a scare to get up. Hee hee, I didn't expect your reaction to be so strong, he said, naughty still laughing. Ah, that was fun, he exclaimed joyfully. All the people there wanted to hang this madman. But they didn't for various reasons. Audrey and Alger because Mr. Fool hadn't said or done anything. Klein because he did not dare to fight against a high sequence and lose his mask. After a few moments, Adrian finally calmed down. Oh fuck, that was great. Leaving that prank of mine aside, what I said before was true. There are many pathways that can turn a man into a woman, but Seer and Sailor are not one of them. Although Seer from sequence 6 onwards can. He then sighed in disappointment. Though there is only one pathway that turns a woman into a man. It's a bit unfair, you know. He looked at Audrey and laughed mischievously. In case you are interested, is the Hunter pathway. Audrey felt a hollow in her stomach. Chariot, that was one of the paths you offered me, right? She asked weakly. Klein and Alger looked at her uncomfortably. If it comforts you a little, before selling you the formula I was going to tell you this. Adrian replied casually, as if commenting on the weather. On a separate note, I want to say this. It will be short. This is not harem. I would never betray Lom in such a horrible way by making it a harem. I wouldn't do that to you who are reading this story either. I'll tell you this too. I hate harems, so don't worry, this book will never become nor have that in it. I don't want you guys to get a bad idea just because I introduced a lot of female characters and hardly any male ones. There will also be men, but that will take time, so please be patient with me. Sorry if there was any confusion. Have a nice night and see you later in the day. Audrey was looking at Chariot dumbly, the man was just leaning back in his chair. She looked away from the man and looked at her lap, she raised her hands and looked at her palms. She could see the softness and delicacy of them, the result of multiple creams and massages. This image was replaced by rough, calloused hands, the hands of a man. She shook her head. She then looked at the hanged man and Chariot with a small smile. Gentlemen, I have a question. When am I going to completely digest the spectator potion and stop acting? Is there a standard that indicates when I can? I have almost reached the point where I no longer feel frustrated, nor do I hear the constant murmurs. She wanted to change the topic of conversation as quickly as possible. The sooner she puts this behind her, the easier it will be for her to forget the fact that she could have become a man if she have chosen the hunter. Alger looked at the fool in the mist but saw that he had no intention of speaking. He then turned to look at Chariot, but the redhead was just staring at the ceiling. This made his eyebrow twitch. He then deliberated before saying, if you don't use the acting method, the typical rule of thumb is to wait 3 years and confirm that you no longer feel restless or suffer from any hearing or visual illusions. With regards to the acting method, I too have barely come into contact with it. It feels good, so it shouldn't take 3 years. That didn't help Mr. Hanged Man. 3 years, that's too long. Audrey criticized internally. She had barely had that thought when the sound of an armrest being tapped rang out. She turned to look at the fool with glee. Alger straightened up and waited for him to speak. 14, 15. Adrian kept his attention on the ceiling, counting the crimson stars. Klein spoke in his normal tone of voice while looking at all the people in front of him. For low sequence beyonders, as long as you stick strictly to acting, you should be able to digest the potion in half a year. It's even possible to do it in a month. He turned to Justice and added, and from the digestion signs, you'll know when it comes. There's no need to teach this. 1 month. Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Fool. Audrey exclaimed with joy. Miss Justice, do not think that you are the chosen one. The key point is half a year. Klein calmly raised his right hand and placed it next to his lips. Half a year, Alger repeated softly. Audrey sensed the joy, relief, and intense doubt in his tone. What are you thinking? Audrey thought. Before she could say anything, a familiar laugh rang out. Hee hee, Can I add something, Mr. Fool? Slowly turning her head, she saw how the relaxed figure of Chariot was looking at the fool. What do you want now? Are you going to tell me that method acting will turn me into a woman too? Klein thought exasperatedly. He was still stinging from Chariot's earlier prank. Ads by PubFuture. But swallowing his annoyance, he nodded. Go ahead, Mr. Chariot. In the Tarot Club, there was no one more familiar with the acting method than Mr. Chariot. It would be a bad idea not to listen to the advice of the elder. Adrian looked at the figures in front of him and spoke calmly. Contrary to popular belief, there is no minimum time required to digest a potion. All that matters is the quality of the acting, stage, and audience. If your act is big and spectacular enough, it is possible to digest the potion in only one act. Audrey was ecstatic about this, completely forgetting what the man had done to her before she asked excitedly. Mr. Chariot, please tell me the way to do this act. Don't worry about the price. Alger was also very interested in what Chariot had said. He was already considering getting the Sphinx's brain for free in exchange for this information, but on second thought he realized that the money he would turn down would not be enough. Klein simply rested his cheek on his left palm and watched this calmly. He was eager to obtain this wonderful method. But before the surprised eyes of the people present, Adrian shook his head calmly. This kind of thing isn't something you can just set up, Miss Justice. They are rare and rarely occur unless you are actively looking for them or run into them by chance. For this reason, it is common to digest the potion in a month or half a year, because acting opportunities are difficult to find and take advantage of. What I want to get at is that one of the difficulties for the Beyonders when it comes to acting is the lack of opportunities. If you are lucky enough to come across this opportunity, what you have to do is make the best of the situation and act to the best of your ability. Adrian finished explaining and returned his attention to the ceiling. The trio that was there was digesting what Chariot had said. There is no minimum time required. Only the act and the audience matter. Klein took note of everything the man had said and found that this fit with several things he had experienced. In the Divination Club I am recognized as a seer. I can feel that the potion reacts. Is that the feedback from the audience that Chariot is saying? I can digest the potion in one act. Great. I just have to find a great opportunity to act as a spectator. Wait, how would I do that? How am I supposed to get that? Audrey had at first been elated by this revelation, but when she gave herself a moment to think, she realized a problem. She was too popular. Even now, the most she could get was a few moments to spectate before being called upon to join the conversation or dance. That meant that finding a great opportunity to act as a spectator would be next to impossible. At this realization, Audrey couldn't control herself and puffed out her cheeks, annoyed. The impact hadn't been very strong for Alger. It had just given him several ideas to act on and try to prove what Chariot had said. Audrey looked at the hanged man and Chariot, and seeing that no one was speaking, she turned to look at the fool. Mr. Fool, have you considered including more members? Klein leaned back in his seat casually. He had prepared an answer long ago. This started out as an attempt, so I didn't give it much thought about extending our meetings. Ads by PubFuture. But now, like a regular meeting, we must choose our members carefully. Secrecy is our motto. Audrey nodded gently and said, that is to say that we must follow a process of observation, recommendation, and testing process. Yes, a process. You can interpret it that way, Klein stated. He was thinking about how to get more information about the secret order and the clown potion. Thinking of the name of his next sequence made the corners of his mouth twitch. Seer, Clown, and Magician. According to Chariot, sequence 6 of the Seer pathway will allow me to disguise myself as a woman. Maybe is it called shapeshifter? I went from circus work to circus phenomenon. Klein thought lamentably. Seeing that Justice didn't say anything else, Alger took the initiative to speak. I have heard that a listener of the Aurora Order is looking for traces of the true creator. What is the holy residence they advocate? Don't you have more information, Mr. Hanged Man? Audrey asked curiously. The information she had bought against her will had helped her figure out who the Hanged Man was talking about. Alger shook his head. It's just a rumor. I just found it interesting to mention, he said while looking not so discreetly at the fool. Hey, what do you think you're doing spying on me like that? Do you want to know my review on the true creator? Klein recalled the information he had read along with what Captain Dunn had seen in Hannah's Vincent's dream. Shadows and hanging, didn't these represent evil connotations? An idea popped into his head, so he chuckled and said, I'm more inclined to call him the fallen creator. The corners of Adrian's mouth trembled at this. Sometimes I wonder if Klein remembers that everything he had invented in a breath ended up becoming a reality or being a hidden truth. Sighing internally and hiding his true thoughts, he laughed in amusement and nodded at Klein's words. You are right, Mr. Fool, it is much more appropriate to call him Fallen. Wait, I am right, Klein thought, taken by surprise. This had only been his way of joking, but it turns out that he had said something correct. Not only that, but was it something Chariot agreed to? He lightly pressed the corners of his mouth together to keep them from rising into a smile. This will make my mask stronger. He didn't say anything, just nodded carelessly. Alger, who had still been processing what the fool had said, was surprised at what Chariot had said. Before he could say anything else, Adrian spoke serious. I've managed to get information that the Aurora Order are trying to do something in Tingen City. I still need more information, but what I've gathered is related to a ritual of some kind that points to the fallen creator. Klein felt his stomach drop. What? Klein felt his blood run cold and his mind slow down. A ritual in Tingen, one that points to an evil god. What am I supposed to do? While Klein was falling into a cycle of despair, the other members kept talking. What do you mean by ritual, Mr. Chariot? Is it a large-scale sacrifice? Is there anything we can do? Audrey asked, very concerned. Unconsciously she put a hand to her heart. Alger nodded in agreement to Justice's words. He looked to Chariot and the fool for answers. I haven't gotten much, I need to do more research before I can do anything. But I've managed to discover that it has to do with a large-scale sacrifice that should take about a month to be completed. Adrian said darkly. Oh goddess, Audrey muttered in fear. She tapped her chest 4 times counterclockwise in a circle. I'll be investigating more, looking for more clues, but I can't promise anything. Adrian said heavily. Why don't we anonymously notify churches? They should be able to deal with this much more easily. Alger suggested. That's right, Mr. Hanged Man. Good idea. Audrey and Klein immediately agreed, though only Audrey showed it. But Adrian shook his head. There is someone very dangerous behind this ritual. It doesn't matter if we tell the churches what is happening, the only thing we would achieve would be to reveal that we know what they plan to do, and that will be enough for them to discover us. This person is capable of diverting the churches' attention long enough to complete the ritual. But it would also make him nervous and end the ritual early, but that doesn't mean there are no consequences, the redhead said mysteriously. At Chariot's words, Audrey bit the inside of her cheek and turned to look at the fool for help and answers. Klein saw the look that the only lady of the Tarot Club was sending him and could only lament internally. I have no way of intervening in this, Miss Justice. I'm just a little sequence 9. But he knew he couldn't keep quiet, it would ruin his image, so he quickly made up a true lie. My blessed one is in Tingen now, I will entrust him with the investigation of this, he said serenely. He then turned to look at Chariot. If you get more information about this, remember to pray to me and I will pass it on to him. His voice carried power and calm, as if the ritual towards an evil god was rubbish for him. A blessed, Mr. Fool has a blessed, Alger thought in a daze. Audrey was also surprised by this, but she already considered the fool to be a great existence. That he had a blessed was not what surprised her, but that he sent this blessed to investigate something related to an evil god. This proves that Mr. Fool is a benign existence. He could easily have ignored this because it was none of his business, but he didn't. He cares about people's lives. Audrey was relieved and happy. Her image of the fool had gone up multiple notches in her book. By blessed, you are not referring to yourself, right, Klein? The way Adrian thought of this was not a question but a statement. His expression was calm, not having been in the least shocked by the revelation of the fool's blessed. Klein noticed this, but before he could complain, Chariot nodded seriously. I'll keep you informed of any progress I make, Mr. Fool. Ads by PubFuture. That's good, that's good. Klein inwardly sighed with relief, outwardly he nodded. This will not be without reward, Mr. Chariot. He added calmly, but didn't say anything else. Leaving a generous image is important. This way Chariot will have more reason to work hard to investigate this. I have to pray that he doesn't ask for anything and decides to accumulate contribution points. At that thought he sighed internally. When the time comes for Chariot to redeem these contribution points, what am I supposed to give him? An invitation for iced tea in the afternoon. Klein's thoughts were similar to those of Adrian, who suppressed a smile. What will you give me, Klein? A cake with the words written on it. You still are the poor god. He sighed internally and fell silent, turning his attention back to the crimson stars. One of these stars is Little Sun. Adrian let his mind wander. This move was quite a risky one. He had considered a lot on what to do and finally came to a conclusion. He would give Klein crumbs so he could defend himself in his first life. This was the best way to avoid drawing too much attention from 008. One would consider that what he had said before was not a crumb but the whole bread, but that was not the case. It was simply a way to divert Klein's attention. He wasn't too worried that the poor god would die for being curious. Klein was too careful to make a risky move. More knowing that there is a hand behind all this. Make good use of this, Klein. He had given IM the tool, now it remained for Klein to know how to use it. While the main reason was for Klein to defend himself against the useless writer, there was also a second reason. A reason not so pure. And that reason was acting in advance. The useless writer's uselessness gave him plenty of room to try to conspire against him. It could be considered that this would be a small game of chess with Klein being the Black King and the Nighthawks the black pieces. The game had already started and Klein was at a huge disadvantage. But Adrian planned to be the hand that would help him turn the tables. He didn't plan to play to checkmate the useless writer, but rather to save as many as possible. Klein looked at the people in front of him and seeing how each one was in their own worlds, he decided to end the meeting. Let's end the meeting here, he said calmly. The other members recovered and quickly said their goodbyes. By your will, the three said at the same time. Ads by PubFuture. He watched as the figures vanished, but he remained seated in his chair. Klein began tapping on his armrest as he sank into thought. What Chariot said is a matter of emergency, but how can I reveal this to the captain? I have no way of revealing the source of this information without revealing that there is something wrong with me. A large-scale ritual, Klein murmured seriously. I'll try to investigate for any signs that might indicate Aurora Order activity, so I could use this as an excuse to say that I discovered the ritual by accident. This will not draw too much attention to me and will avoid raising any suspicion as to where this information came from. According to Chariot's words, it will take a little over a month for the ritual to be completed. I have that long to try to find any Aurora Order activity and use them as a distraction. But if I fail, he narrowed his eyes slightly. His gaze was dazed. The faces of Benson and Melissa appeared in his mind. If I fail to find any information before the end of August, the first will tell the captain about this, he decided. He would hide from where he had obtained the information along with the existence of the Tarot Club. That was his most important secret and he had to protect it. But there was a problem. I'm still too weak. I need to digest the seer potion as quickly as possible and advance to Clown to make it safer to investigate. He could try to use divination to find the place where this ritual would be performed, but he immediately rejected that idea. That was a ritual to an evil god. He had no idea what would happen if he saw something he shouldn't in the middle of divination. The experience with Chariot was a good reminder of what could happen if he was not careful when divining. Klein remained in his seat and looked up at the crimson stars. If he wanted to have a chance at saving Tingen, he needed to get stronger. And to achieve that, the most important thing would be to discover what other abilities this mysterious space had. Looking at the crimson stars, Justice's words echoed in his mind. After a few moments of silence, Klein began to pray as a form of feedback instead of making a connection to those stars. In the stillness and silence, he did not receive any feedback from the more than 10 crimson stars around him. In order to receive feedback, I need to get someone above the gray fog before I can respond. Klein nodded slightly. He did not plan to violate someone else's will by forcibly bringing them into this mysterious space. Sighing, Klein was ready to leave, but he habitually touched a nearby crimson star. Just then, he felt that there was a faint and insignificant prayer deep within this crimson star. Multiple balls of fire floated in an abandoned office. They moved gently like fireflies illuminating the dark room. Sitting on top of the old desk, Adrian watched this scene calmly. He was now in the abandoned ceramics factory. He was using this factory as a kind of hideout. There were various traps throughout this place, inside and out, whose sole purpose was to keep away any bums who might want to enter when he was here. When he wasn't here, he deactivated these traps. He just used it to attend the Tarot Club and other things. Attending the meeting in his room was very dangerous. If someone entered when he was not in his body, he could not do anything to defend himself. He couldn't place all the traps he wanted to attend comfortably and without worrying about someone attacking him. And the traps he had set up in his room wouldn't be able to help him if the person who entered was determined to kill him. That is why he decided to use this factory. He could prepare all the traps he wanted and attend calmly. Sighing, Adrian snapped his fingers and the fireballs went out, returning the office to its darkness. Every 2 to 4 days I will be giving information to Klein so that he pays attention to certain details around him. he would wait for the right moment to give the key information to Klein. If he did this right, he wouldn't have to lift a single muscle against the useless writer. Klein would take care of playing against him, without even knowing that he is playing. A sharp smile grew on the redhead's face. Don't worry, Klein, you won't have to worry about looking for evidence. Because it will come to you. Klein will get all the evidence he needs when he kills Sirius Arapis. This guy is a member of the Aurora Order and one of the people who helped make the ritual possible. When Klein killed him and searched his body, he found several letters that talked about various things. One of the most important was a large-scale human sacrifice using Tingen. When Klein read this letter, he had not given it the importance it deserved due to the lack of information and also because he thought he had already stopped this ritual from happening by killing Sirius. And it was not only Klein but the Nighthawk Captain Dunn that thought the same thing. They were wrong. The ritual was completed a long time ago and the result of it was growing stronger every day inside a woman's womb. Unfortunately, due to this huge mistake, both of them died, saving Tingen from what was born from the ritual. But now, with the information he had given Klein, he would make sure the Nighthawks took this seriously. If Klein manages to convince Dunn that this is cause for alarm, reinforcements may be called in and the useless writer will find himself in a very difficult situation. When this happens and the church is informed, he knows that it will be impossible to use 008 so that it is ignored, since this would alert the church even more and they would send stronger people. If he is not careful, an angel could arrive. So he will have to accept that reinforcements have to arrive and complicate his plan, but he will undoubtedly make the reinforcements a small team by making the request not so urgent with the help of 008. Maybe it will be Sesimir and his team. Crestet Sesimir, one of the 9 high-ranking deacons of the Church of the Evernight Goddess. One of the 3 powerhouses of the Red Gloves. AKA the Goddess's Sword. It would be ridiculous for the reinforcement to deal with a large-scale sacrifice to an evil god to be weak. That would be an unreasonable development. The useless writer would know this and would have no choice but to accept a demigod entering the board. With just a little bit of information, he had balanced the Black King's side a bit more. But this would not be enough. Raising a hand to his chin, Adrian thought more deeply about his next move. 008 is too powerful, he will make sure that Sesimir and his team are far away when he attacks. I also can't deny the possibility that he will try to hide Megos at all costs. Adrian shook his head. No. 100% he will hide Megos at the slightest sign of danger. He will not only hide her but he will make sure that someone protects her until the day of the attack. He won't do it himself, he's too much of a coward for that and wouldn't risk his presence being discovered. No. He would use a third party for this. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Aurora Order. He will use the Aurora Order to protect this woman until everything is ready. The useless writer had already used this organization once to create that thing. What prevented him from using it again to protect it? Besides, who would protect her so fiercely if not them? It was the child of their god after all. Adrian's eyes narrowed even more. Involving the Aurora Order would be the smart thing to do to counter whatever team is sent, but is also very risky. Getting more pieces onto the board would only make it more difficult to control. I can't deny the probability that he has a trick up his sleeve. Adrian wasn't sure what that ace could be, the only thing he was sure of was that it had to exist. The useless writer had been preparing for this for too long, it would be ridiculous if he didn't have at least one. There was also his strongest weapon, one that Adrian was very familiar with from his abilities and capabilities. If he doesn't have a trick up his sleeve, it's because 008 is that trick. As long as the useless writer has 008 on his hands, anything can happen. Sighing, Adrian got up from the desk. Just as he was putting his mask on, the temperature in the room dropped and a chill ran up his spine. Finally, the redhead sighed as he tapped his palm twice with his finger. The familiar door of bones formed quickly. When the skull of that giant bird joined, it opened and Chicho came out. Good afternoon, Chicho, Adrian said in Elvish with a small smile. Good afternoon, Chicho greeted with her thick accent and a hard nod. She then extended something to him. From an old man, she said as Adrian took it and looked at it with a smile. It was a bell made of old black metal, with various details in the shape of bones and spirals throughout its body. All these spirals and bones of different animals were connected in the skull of a bird that was detailed in the body of the bell. It was identical to the summoning bell from Bloodborne and it had details in the style of Adrian Kenway. This was what he had ordered at the party of the detective the last week. Now I no longer have to make an altar every time I want to send a letter. The redhead thought satisfied as he looked at Chicho with a smile. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an almond chocolate bar. Thanks again, Chicho, he said as he extended the bar to Chicho, who took it nodding slightly. She unwrapped the bar and began to eat it as she disappeared into her bony door. It seems the almond one is her favorite. Adrian thought. He had seen how the giant's gray eyes lit up when she saw what the bar was. Putting that aside, he lowered his head and looked at the bell with a smile. He put the bell in a larger pocket of his jacket and opened the letter that came with it. Thank you for hiring our service. Hey Mr. Unknown. It's been a while since you last asked for something. I was worried that you died or worse. That you have already found another craftsman and replaced me. The corners of Adrian's mouth twitched. You say that like we have something. I'm glad that's not the case and I'm still your only craftsman. I hope you like the artifact I made for you last time. I thought the next time you contacted me it would be to make you another artifact, but I was wrong. You know, it's not the first time that I've been asked to do something to contact a messenger, but it's certainly the first time that someone is so specific with what they want. The normal thing is that it is something simple, a whistle for example. But you asked me for a bell. And not only that, but you also specified the details that it had to have. You are very interesting, you know. The way it works is simple: send some spirituality and shake it. It'll last you 2 years, so I hope we'll still be friends when it's turn to replace it. We are friends, right? I hope you don't mind if I write you the odd letter. Don't worry, I will not write to you about mundane things, but about jobs that may interest you and favors that I would like to ask you. Again, don't worry, you will have a good pay. Also, don't worry about the price. You can consider me having the incantation for your messenger the payment. If you need me to do something for you, all you have to do is send me a letter. P.S. Your messenger is also very interesting. I get why you asked to put all those details. The craftsman. Adrian had a weird expression. What the fuck is this? He mumbled, confused. The personality of this grandfather confused him more and more. Are you so lonely that as soon as someone texts you twice, you already consider them your friend? Life in the church of the god of machinery and steam must be sad and depressing. Adrian knew well that a craftsman not from this church was very rare. So he was sure that this grandfather was part of it. But it seems his faith isn't very strong considering he's accepting custom jobs from wild beyonders and selling them artifacts. I don't know how the measures of that church work, but it is very likely that if someone knew what you are doing, the minimum punishment would be death. Thinking about that, an idea came to his head that made a sharp smile grow on his face. In other words, revealing this guy would also mean a juicy reward. Thinking so, Adrian let out a soft laugh while shaking his head. If he wanted to do that, he would have done it a long time ago. He had the contacts to do it. But it didn't for a very simple reason. If I did and lost this guy, who would make his artifacts? With that thought, he crumpled the letter into a ball which he then burned. Besides, those jobs and favors might be interesting. Shaking his head in amusement, he left the office and the factory. He still had several things to do. Today was Monday, July 30th, 1349. In 15 days it would be the mission of the snake. He had to prepare himself for whatever the diabetic snake would throw at him. Tuesday morning. Adjusting his expensive and elegant suit jacket, Glaint sighed nervously. You can do it, Glaint. Short and long breaths, short and long breaths, he encouraged himself as he repeated the exercise his psychologist had taught him. He was standing in front of Dutch Wilson's mansion. The mansion had been rebuilt after what had happened in June. It seemed as if what happened that Saturday had never happened. This was another reason why he hadn't come to visit Dutch. Every time he remembered this place he would have a panic attack. Only after intense sessions with Miss Jane had he managed to recover. And he had only come here after speaking with her yesterday, having her go ahead that this would be a good step in his recovery. So steeling himself, he walked over and knocked on the door. Knock knock. He took 2 steps away from the door and waited. After a few seconds, the door was opened and an older butler with several wrinkles on his face along with a completely bald top of his head welcomed him. Welcome back, Master Glaint. Master Dutch is waiting for you in his office. Would you like me to come with you? He said with a courteous smile, and Glaint nodded, still a bit nervous. Thanks, Alfred, but I can go alone. He shook his head as he walked in and Alfred nodded. No problem, Master Glaint, Alfred answered as he closed the door and went to do other work. Come on, Glaint, you can do it. For Dutch, Glaint encouraged himself and walked in the direction of the stairs. Dutch's office was on the 1st floor. Arriving at the once familiar but now strange door of fine wood, Glaint felt his heart race. Short and long breaths, short and long breaths, short and long. Glaint repeated the exercise about 6 more times, and when his heart had calmed down a bit, he knocked on the door 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. Reaching down, Glaint reached into his pocket and taking out his handkerchief, he used it to wipe the sweat from his forehead. After a few seconds that seemed like forever, a familiar but strange voice sounded from behind the door. Come in, Glaint, it's open. Here I go, here I go. Glaint thought, and grasping the door handle with a shaking hand, he opened the door. The office was a little different than he remembered. Where before there were some fine porcelain vessels, now there were some plants that looked well cared for. Sitting at an old wooden desk but with multiple and excellent details covering the entire body of the table, was a somewhat pale Dutch. The man wore a white shirt and reading glasses. There were several neatly arranged documents to one side and he was going through one now. It seemed that Glaint had arrived in the middle of his work. Looks like he hasn't been out in the sun for a while. Glaint frowned worriedly at his friend's skin. It's been a while, Glaint. How have you been, my good friend? Dutch asked warmly, his lips a little dry. Glaint shook his head slightly. He looked at Dutch, his eyes shining with concern. I'm better, Dutch. I'm sorry I haven't visited you in the last month. How are you feeling? Have you seen a psychologist after that? Glaint asked. He hadn't said party because he had seen how his friend's face had broken at almost mentioning it. Recovering himself, Dutch sighed wearily and pointed to the chair in front of his desk. You don't have to apologize, Glaint. I was the one who's been ignoring you all this time. Please sit down. Dutch apologized sincerely. Glaint shook his head but complied with his friend's request and sat across from him, then he spoke. You don't have to apologize either, Dutch. What happened that night would tear anyone apart. Dutch laughed sadly as he shook his head in defeat. He looked down at the document he had been reviewing and spoke tiredly. You also went through the same thing, but you still found time to write and worry about me. Unlike you, I stayed locked up here, without talking or going out with anyone. Sinking into my work so as not to think about what happened. Dutch's words died in his mouth and he fell silent. Glaint didn't say anything, he let his friend vent. He had been the same when he first visited Miss Jane and he had vented it to her. It had helped a lot to calm his mind, and now he would do the same for his friend. He would listen to the pain that he had locked up in his heart all this time. After a few seconds, Dutch sighed. He was full of exhaustion and sadness. He then raised his head, a small sad smile on his face. The worst were the funerals, you know. I made sure that all of them received the best funeral service I could afford. That did nothing to ease the guilt. That wasn't your F.A. Glaint yelled at his friend, but his words died in his throat. Tears fell from Dutch's eyes. You know, Glaint, when all the funerals were completed and all the families were able to say goodbye to their loved ones, I came here in this office and grabbed my father's revolver. Glaint's eyes widened, and his skin turned pale. Dutch lowered his head. I didn't have the courage to do it. He calmly grabbed a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his face. Calmly folding the handkerchief, Dutch spoke again. When that happened, I realized that I needed help. I went to the goddess and prayed. Every time I prayed to her, I felt better and better. A small smile settled on Dutch's face as he raised his head and looked at the frozen Glaint. I'm finally recovering after a month. It's a slow process, but I think I'll make it. He then turned his head and looked at a painting that had a beautiful night landscape painted with the crimson moon high in the sky. Thanks to the moon, he said with faith as he saw the moon painted on the painting. Finally, after all that, Glaint recovered and looked at Dutch in alarm. You need a psychologist. I know a good one at Empress Borough Hospital. She can help you. No need to get so nervous, Glaint. Dutch cut into the flustered Glaint as he held up a hand. Glaint looked at Dutch in astonishment. You tried to kill yourself, Dutch. You need professional help. He stressed, but Dutch shook his head seriously. All I need is to give my pain to the goddess and she will free me from it. He said like the staunchest believer. There was a bit of annoyance in his eyes. Glaint noticed this thanks to being friends with Dutch for so long. He was silent for a few seconds and looked seriously at his friend. He then sighed in defeat and nodded with his eyes closed. You're right. As long as we surrender to the goddess, she will free us from the pain that plagues us and let us sleep with sweet dreams. He said with faith, tapping his chest 4 times counterclockwise in a circle. Dutch looked at this with a small smile as he nodded. He did not repeat the prayer posture. Dutch looked at his friend and asked, I really appreciate having you here, Glaint, but I still have a lot of work to do. Tell me, do you need anything else? Glant's eyes widened and he scratched his cheek somewhat awkwardly. Actually, yes. I hope you don't mind, but I was wondering if you have an extra matured manhellfish's eyeball in your collection. Dutch's eyes widened somewhat in surprise. Are you going to become a spectator? I thought you wanted to be an apothecary. He asked curiously. Glant shook his head and sighed. And I still want to be one, it's just that I can't find the formula and the eyeball is for a friend who needs it to avoid being punished. Dutch exclaimed in understanding. He put a hand to his chin and after thinking about it for a moment he nodded. I still have an extra one, you can take it with you, just tell Alfred to give it to you and that's it. Glant sighed in relief and extended his hand to Dutch. Thank you very much, friend, you saved me from this. What do you want in return? Dutch chuckled softly as he took Glant's hand. I don't want anything, consider it a gift to thank you for caring and coming to visit me. Glant put his other hand over Dutch's. You are my friend, how could I not care about my friend? He responded with a smile but then frowned in concern. Remember, if you need a psychologist or someone to talk to, just write me a letter and I'll come as fast as I can. Dutch smiled and nodded. Of course, Glant. He separated his hand from his friend and grabbed the document he was working with earlier. Have a good evening, my good friend. You too, Glant said with a small smile. Dutch just nodded and returned his attention to the document in hand. Glant looked at his friend for a few seconds before getting up from his chair and going to the door. Opening it and before leaving the room, he turned to look at Dutch but he kept his attention on the document from before. Sighing, he closed the door and let the man get on with his work. Alfred was downstairs. After asking for the matured manhellfish's eyeball, he went and brought it to him in a small silver container that he kept in his pocket. With his job done, he left Dutch's mansion. Having sent the container to Audrey hidden inside a necklace box, Glant was now in his own office. While signing some documents, he couldn't help but think of something that had confused him a bit. Dutch would never have given me something from his collection just because. He then sighed sadly and continued working. Trauma really changes people.